God is the life giver. To live apart from God is to live apart from the source of life. This is one of the lessons we learn from the youngest son in Jesus' parable of the lost son in Luke 15. A man who represents God has two sons. The youngest of the sons asks for his share of the estate and sets off on his own. This is a slap to the face of the father. In a nutshell, the youngest son is saying something along the lines of, Dad, you're worth more to me dead than alive. I value the physical stuff that you can give me more than a relationship with you. But the father obliges, and the son soon leaves for distant lands and ends up losing all of the wealth that he was given by the father. Here we see the rebellious side of the youngest son. He no longer wants to remain in the presence of the one who gave and sustains his life. Instead, he wants nothing to do with his father and sees his father as a means to his own desires. Does this not sound familiar? Does this not sound like the story of humanity? Does it not sound like Adam and Eve at the beginning of creation choosing their own desires over the desires of God? Or in our own stories when we choose to live outside of the righteous ways of God? Christians sometimes chalk the comparison of the youngest son up to just being non Christians. But Christians can also connect to the youngest son. Anytime we sin, anytime we create brokenness, anytime we push ourselves away from the life giver, we live out the story of the youngest son in rebellion. When we find ourselves distanced from the life giver, we face the consequences that the youngest son did. There was not just one thing that happened to the youngest son for him to wind up starving and longing to feed himself with the pods that pigs were eating. There were three things that happened. The first is that he squandered his wealth in wild living. The youngest son did not live wisely. We get the picture that the father was a rich man. Even his hired hands had food to spare. The father lives wisely with his resources, but the youngest son chose not to mirror the life of his father. He instead chose to live his own way. He lives a wild life which leads him to the loss of all the wealth that his father gave him. The second thing is that there was a severe famine in the whole country. After he spent all that he had, a severe famine hit the whole land, and it was then that the youngest son began to be in need. Outside of the presence of his father, the youngest son was not protected against the chaos of the world. He was left to fend for himself and was unable to do so. He hired himself out and became a pig feeder, but even that was not enough to prevent him from starving. The third thing is that no one gave him anything. His situation was so abysmal that in his starvation he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. In his distressed situation, no one helped him. There was no generosity or support or even pity that was shown to him. In his separation from the father, the youngest son was affected by his own unrighteous decisions, and by the chaos of the world, and by the selfishness of others. In his return to the father, his needs are more than taken care of. His father clothes him in the finest robes, kills the fattened calf, and they feast upon his arrival. He found life in his Father, just as we find life in God, who is the life giver. Now, this parable is not a health and wealth gospel message. And we will see in our discussion of the oldest son that remaining in the presence of the Father was not easy. Of the many things that this parable does tell us, we see in the youngest son two important things. We see the importance of remaining in the presence of the Father, and we see the consequences of what happens when we rebel. Remaining in the presence of the Father does not mean that we won't make mistakes. It does not mean that we won't experience famines that affect a whole country or viruses that affect the whole world. It also does not mean that we won't experience selfish individuals who are looking only after themselves. Remaining in the presence of the Father means that we have hope that the failures we make, that the chaos in the world around us, and that the brokenness of others don't seal our fate. The youngest son calls out two things. To those in the presence of the Father, he cries, "Don't imitate me. Don't run from the presence of God, for if you do, trouble awaits you in the end." To those who find themselves in the troubles that come from living outside of the presence of God, he cries, "Return. Return to the life giver, for God is waiting for you with open arms of love."